embrace your natural self. A guided reflection. Right now, you are likely carrying a cold, tight constriction that anchors itself directly at the very base of your skull, pulling heavily across your upper shoulder blades while a restless, burning heat sits directly behind your eyeballs. It is the grueling, exhausting ache of moral perfectionism and self-scrupulosity, an internal hypervigilance born from a day spent reviewing your own behaviors, double-checking if you said the wrong thing, and micromanaging your expressions. You lie completely motionless, but your mind is still aggressively scrubbing the fabric of your past actions, trying to force away any perceived flaw through an intense application of internal shame. This desperate urge to correct your character feels like your only defense against being cast out, yet the relentless evaluation of your ordinary human limits is exactly what keeps your nervous system raw. Your neck remains rigidly tensed against the mattress, and your breathing feels restricted from treating a minor social misstep as a deep stain that must be bleached before morning. The atmosphere within your room has gathered the dense, still cooling of a stone-walled well house, the faint, clean trace of wet limestone, and the quiet presence of a freezing midnight fog, softening the sharp angles outside. Let the base of your skull settle into the deep coolness of the unmoving stone tonight, completely unaffected by how many perceived shortcomings you are trying to erase in your thoughts. There is a deep, quiet truth waiting for you in this dark hour. An understanding that your essential worth has never been compromised or ruined by the natural friction of your human expressions. Your core consciousness is not a defective fabric that requires a violent, midnight scrubbing to be considered pure, and no sudden, forced bleaching of your natural texture will be demanded of your spirit tonight. Your fundamental nature remains entirely whole, unblemished, and safe, exactly as you are. We often believe that our persistent self-policing is a necessary discipline, a virtue that protects our standing, or that if we stop checking our flaws for a single evening, our entire integrity will dissolve into ruin. But a surprising, liberating insight from the ancient path suggests that our systemic exhaustion comes from a completely different kind of misunderstanding. The mind does not suffer because our character carries ordinary human limitations, but because we are continuously using our precious midnight vitality to violently rub an unbleached flax cloth over a corrugated board, convinced that the organic beige flecks and seed husk remnants inherent to the fiber are deep, hidden stains that we must force out with harsh lime water. This desperate attempt to fix the self turns our rest into an active workspace because we are treating our own natural, unpolished grain as an emergency that we must manually extract before the sun rises. You are straining your own muscles out of a quiet fear of being found defective, forgetting that original nature is already radiant precisely because it contains these natural variations. It is deeply draining to live your life as a relentless cleaner of your own history, constantly gripping a rough surface while your upper back absorbs the dry stress of your self-shaming. Right now, dear friend, you might notice a distinct, rigid tightness locking the large tendons that run from the back of your ears down to your collarbones. This physical armor is the direct cost of a mind that has been keeping the evaluation work active, hour after hour, treating the natural silence of your evening as an empty space that must be scrutinized for hidden faults. Maybe you have felt this too, a heavy weight that makes it impossible to fully receive a peaceful rest, because you are still mentally measuring your current stillness against an idealized image of absolute moral perfection. We assume that if we can just scrub our presentation thoroughly enough, we will eventually earn the right to exist without guilt. But keeping the raw friction of your self-criticism so close to your focus only ensures that your sleep is disrupted by the strain. In a short while, our journey will lead us to a stone-walled communal washhouse next to a deep mountain well during a freezing midnight fog, offering a completely fresh way to relate to this driven mind. But before we wander out onto those cool flagstones, let us sit softly with the immediate reality of how your body is resting right now. The anticipation of being judged or found wanting can feel like a cold, sharp band wrapped tightly around the base of your skull, its restriction keeping your attention vibrating even when the room is dark. You have policed this internal field for many hours, believing that if you allowed your focus to cool without a complete plan for correcting your perceived flaws, your security would remain vulnerable forever. But notice how much energy it takes to keep those old accusations spinning beneath your sheets. Your upper shoulders have grown hard from the investment, and your palms are tensed against the fabric. Allow a wide, unhurried expansion to clear the sharp scent of the alkaline water from your chest, letting the damp fog move through your center without any resistance or force. As you let that current pass, notice if there is even a tiny pocket of space where the root of your neck can loosen completely, letting your skull base spread out like a wide sheet of smooth stone. You do not have to finish the renovation of your soul before the sun rises, and you do not need to find a perfect justification for your past actions to prove your readiness for sleep. The fabric is unrolled, the natural flecks require no further scrubbing, and the water rests clear in the basin, far below the surface of your current awareness. There is no requirement to bleach the raw fiber before the dark allows you to rest, and you may let your head sink flat upon the supportive stillness for the night, allowing the cool air to take the dust while your presence dissolves into the deep quiet. The heavy identity of being a flawed candidate who must permanently erase their true nature is not your permanent essence, because the standards that taught you that defense are completely external, existing now only as a habit of urgency inside your muscles. What you are actually carrying is your ongoing effort to predict a future judgment, a quiet, internal panic that your dignity cannot survive without the protection of your self-condemnation. Every time you replay the details of your past conversations to validate your restlessness, or hold your body back from a simple moment of rest out of loyalty to your anxiety, you add another layer of unnecessary stress to a frame that was meant to remain light. You are completely permitted to be tired of this constant monitoring, and you may let the unbleached hemp bolt rest completely untouched tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, letting go of the unspoken rules and the silent self-reproaches you have been planning behind your eyes for so long. Let the small muscles around your jaw relax, releasing the constant, vigilant effort to keep your presentation straight against a world that you cannot modify from your pillow. Right now, the stone well house has grown completely silent, and the wet linen requires no supervision tonight, your intervention, or your permission to remain completely quiet. You are safe enough to let the defensive machinery of your thoughts go entirely slack, if it feels right, allowing the echoes of old self-judgments to settle like wood ash into the bottom of the deep well, while the midnight cold clears the last traces of perfectionist heat away into the wide, empty night. The low, heavy settling of the midnight fog against the exterior stone blocks introduces a slow sequence of shadows that gradually spills across the wet floors. Deep within that remote washhouse, where the damp midnight drafts always carried the sharp, alkaline scent of wood ashly and the cold touch of mountain well water, lived a young temple cleaner named Chio. Chio possessed a remarkably precise forearm for lifting heavy cedar tubs, an exceptional endurance for working long winter hours, and a cold, tight constriction located at the very base of her skull. Season after season, the older residents had accepted her cleaned linens without offering a single word of explicit reassurance or direct validation, an omission that had left a permanent, anxious compression directly across her upper shoulder blades. This hidden wound had gradually driven her to become an obsessive reviewer of her own deeds, a person who believed that if she could only demonstrate an unblemished, absolute moral perfection, her belonging would finally be secured, shielding her from the terrifying agony of being found defective. This relentless urge to fix her own nature led Chio to focus heavily on a large, unbleached hemp bolt that lay across her wooden work table. The heavy hand-spun fabric was off-white from the mountain weavers, its rough surface containing thousands of tiny, natural seed husk flecks that were woven directly throughout the core of the fiber. She spent her late hours hovering over this raw material, viewing her constant physical exertion as her ultimate defense against the quiet, dark silence that settled over the temple grounds after the lamps were extinguished. While the older helpers slept soundly in the rear quarters or watched the low embers die out, Chio would remain awake under the low cedar beams, endlessly using a corrugated ash board to violently rub the natural cloth. The rough, ribbed pine wood would scrape against her palms and cause a dry restriction behind her jaw, leaving her hands raw and her mind locked in a state of absolute, frantic monitoring. Her upper neck grew hot from driving the wet fabric over the ridges, yet she refused to let the raw fiber rest, treating her own identity as an imperfect surface that had to be forcibly bleached before the sun rose. As the freezing fog settled into a heavy, motionless mist, turning the stone washhouse into a silent wilderness of gray condensation and dark pooling water, the habit of forcing her own purity turned her late nights into a state of absolute, hollow exhaustion. She would stand before the heavy cedar tub, under the dim, flickering light of a tallow wick, her breathing short and her attention fixed on a single corrugated ashboard that she was using to press the wet cloth into the soapy water. The pine ridges were sharp from years of constant friction, unyielding and hard, refusing to allow the organic beige flecks to separate from the adjacent threads. Her thoughts ran in narrow, exhausting loops of self-policing, replaying every minor conversational error from her morning chores, preventing her diaphragm from ever experiencing a full, unhurried expansion. She was so busy trying to scrub away her natural human variations that she could no longer perceive the deep safety of the shelter, nor could she close her eyes without feeling an impending exposure for her lack of absolute control. Her entire sense of worth had become tied to the corrugated wood, an unhearing tool that remained tensed in her grip while her eyeballs grew increasingly hot. Deep within a small timber-sided alcove near the deep stone well, where the thick stone walls kept the wind from moving the air, lived an elderly helper known as Sister Jinyo. She was a person of immense, slow physical mass, her movements quiet as the falling fog, her forearms broad from decades of handling heavy rinse tubs but entirely free from the tensed, guarding patterns that locked Chiyo's shoulders. She spent her nights walking between the inactive washing stations, checking the copper cauldrons and organizing the willow drying pegs without chasing any minor flaws, living entirely through the immediate baseline of the present hour. One evening, when the gray moisture was pressing thick against the slatted window panels, the old wash nun stepped out from her corner, her steps unhurried as she carried nothing but a blunt wooden ladle and a small basket of dry elderberry stems. She stood near the heavy cedar tub where the young woman worked, her eyes reflecting the dark, spacious quality of the deep well outside. The old woman did not offer a complex lecture on the illusion of perfectionism, and she did not scold the cleaner for wasting her remaining vitality on flecks that were meant to remain inside the weave. She simply walked toward the front of the table, reached out into the cold space beneath the waterline, and touched the thick, unbleached hemp bolt where the fabric met the pine wood. She held her palm flat against the side of the wet cloth, allowing her rough skin to feel the intense heat vibrating down from the youth's frantic fingers, completely unhurried by the steady condensation that filled the room. She looked toward Chiyo's tensed, automated posture, then reached out her blunt wooden ladle, placing its smooth rim directly over the top of the tensed right hand that was still white-knuckled against the corrugated wood. The old woman did not issue a command. She merely took Chiyo's tensed right forearm, the muscles still stiff from hours of continuous rubbing, and guided her wrist down until her palm rested flat against the smooth, bare stone of the open work table. She then reached up with her other hand and gently lifted the corrugated ashboard completely away from the cedar tub, allowing the heavy wood to slide quietly into a dark corner alcove beneath the bench, leaving the raw, unbleached hemp to sit entirely rough and natural in the dimness. Chiyo stood perfectly still in the quiet of the washhouse, her breath catching in her throat as her fingers were held motionless against the stone, letting the natural coolness of the limestone absorb the excess heat with a slow, silent contact. A sudden, deep wave of emotional recognition broke through the frantic loops of her mind, dissolving the tight band that had held her skull base in restriction for so many months. He saw that her frantic scrubbing had never actually altered the value of the linen or accelerated her standing. It had only turned her own mind into a cold, automated board that was keeping her spirit from ever entering the real rest of the night. A long, heavy sigh finally broke from her lips, a slow relaxation that allowed her core to expand. and her upper back gradually dropped, letting her shoulders find their rest flat upon the support beneath her. The corrugated ashboard resting quietly inside the dark corner alcove reveals an open window into our own immediate struggles. When we lie awake in the middle of the night, our thoughts often act exactly like that frantic cleaner in the stone washhouse. We review our words and trace our movements from the day, looking for any small irregularity that might expose us to blame. This teaching does not suggest that you should stop caring about your actions, or that you should become a cold, indifferent stone. It is not an invitation to freeze your genuine empathy or to walk through your life without any personal values. True wisdom points to a completely different type of stillness. It is the realization that the original friction of an imperfect human day is not a permanent stain on your character. The heavy burden you are carrying is actually the secondary heat you create by repeatedly scrubbing your own memory against the sharp ridges of your self-shaming long after the conversation has ended. Life naturally brings its own raw texture. We experience moments of clumsiness, unexpected miscommunications, and intervals where our choices do not match our highest intentions. This initial experience is simply the natural condition of possessing a vulnerable human heart. It is like the organic seed husk flecks that are woven directly into the core of the raw flax yarn. Those small dark spots are not structural defects, and they are not signs of a ruined material. They are simply the historical evidence of the field where the hemp grew under the sun and rain. But our analytical mind refuses to accept this natural landscape. In our panic to guarantee our total safety from criticism, we transform an ordinary human limitation into a definitive moral emergency. We decide that our baseline nature is fundamentally stained, and we begin a brutal process of internal correction that leaves our spirit feeling completely raw. This desperate emotional mechanism is what ancient wisdom describes as the root of our systemic exhaustion. In modern language, we can view this habit as a deep, frantic craving for an artificial perfection that does not exist in the natural world. It is the tense conviction that says you cannot be allowed to rest until you have completely bleached every unique variation out of your history. We assume that if we can just apply enough pressure to our memories, we will eventually produce a flawless character that no one can ever reject. But this intense demand for absolute control acts like a constant stream of boilingly water poured over an open wound. It does not cleanse your heart, and it does not make you more secure. It only destroys the fine protective layers of your own self-respect, keeping your nervous system trapped in a state of perpetual defense. When you look closely at this cycle, you can perceive that your current suffering does not live in the events of your morning. The original words have already left the room, and the people you encountered have already moved forward into their own lives. The event itself has dissolved completely into the freezing midnight fog, leaving the air entirely clear, but the mind refuses to let the water settle. We drag the memory back into our midnight isolation, placing it over the sharp ridges of our self-criticism, and we begin to rub the raw tissue of our identity against the old pattern over and over again. This secondary friction is the extra pain that we manually add to our own lives out of a fear of being found wanting. We are punishing our current frame for a past imperfection, turning our quiet mattress into a harsh workspace where we demand a purity that no living being can sustain. The ancient path offers a beautiful, merciful alternative to this endless cycle of self-correction. It invites us to cultivate a quiet, non-judgmental awareness that can observe the natural texture of our life without immediately reaching for the ashboard. This type of presence is like the deep mountain well that sits quietly in the corner of the washhouse. The well does not judge the water that enters its basin, and it does not try to force the liquid to become anything other than what it is. It simply provides a wide, stable container that allows the sediment to sink to the bottom at its own natural pace. When an anxious thought about your character arises in your awareness tonight, you do not have to obey its command to begin another sequence of mental scrubbing. You can simply notice its presence, name it as an old defensive habit, and let it rest in the spacious stillness of your chest. This soft, observant stance allows us to experience the liberating reality of constant change. Your feelings of inadequacy are not permanent structures carved into the stone of your identity. They are merely temporary clouds of gray moisture passing through the timber framework of your mind. Just as the freezing fog outside shifts and separates under the influence of the midnight wind, your internal anxieties will naturally lose their density if you stop feeding them the heat of your self-scrupulosity. You do not need to wage a violent war against your inner critic to find your peace tonight. You only need to stop providing the constant physical tension that keeps the old board active. By letting your arms go slack, you allow the frantic loops of post-analysis to spend their remaining energy without breaking your rest. True compassion begins when you stop treating the natural, unbleached grain of your humanity as a moral failure that must be violently removed. It is the gentle willingness to look at your mistakes without using them as an excuse to apply the harsh limewater of shame to your own spirit. You can acknowledge that a conversation was difficult, or that you wish you had acted with more clarity, without turning that recognition into a definitive proof that you are broken. This gentle approach does not make you careless or indifferent to others. It actually restores the authentic vitality you need to move through the world with genuine kindness. Because you are no longer burning all your strength on an internal battlefield. You are allowing the fabric of your life to be exactly what it is, a unique hand-spun creation that carries its own organic story in every thread. Let your mind rest on the quiet image of the heavy cedar tub sitting perfectly motionless under the low cedar beams. The water inside the vessel has finally ceased its sloshing, and the surface has become as smooth and clear as a sheet of polished jade. It did not achieve this clarity by being forced or manipulated by a human hand. It became still simply because the worker chose to set down the tools and walk away from the station for the night. Your consciousness is fully capable of this same natural settling right now. You do not need to resolve every doubt about your standing before you allow your eyes to close. And you do not need to complete the cleansing of your soul to be worthy of your own care. The stone washhouse is dark, the copper cauldrons are cold, and the universe is entirely ready to sustain your weight without asking for a single proof of your perfection. As you continue to follow the slow, rhythmic movement of your breathing, notice how the cold constriction at the base of your skull begins to give way to a fluid, spacious warmth. You are giving your upper back permission to drop its heavy guard, letting the old accusations slide away into the dark corners of the floorboards. The demands of your daylight hours have no authority in this quiet room, and they cannot extract a single drop of your current vitality unless you choose to pick up the board. You are completely safe here, surrounded by the still, protective presence of the winter mist, with nothing left to manage and nothing left to fix. Let your boundaries expand into the wide shadow of the evening, watching the old habits of self-policing lose their form until there is nothing left but the quiet, effortless rising of your chest, holding you safe in the deep rest of the hour. Let us take a quiet moment to pause right here, allowing the deep, cool moisture of the stone well house to settle softly around the space where you are resting. There is absolutely no requirement to arrive at any sudden conclusion tonight, and no pressure is being placed upon your intelligence to justify a single piece of your afternoon's interactions before the morning comes. If it feels right, allow your awareness to move gently toward the natural, unforced movement of your breath. Just as it is occurring in this exact second, you do not need to alter its rhythm, and you do not need to make it conform to any idealized standard of perfect internal alignment. Simply observe the cool sensation of the air as it touches your nostrils, and follow the soft collapse of your abdomen as that breath returns to the room. With each exhalation, perhaps you might permit your jaw, your upper back, and the very small muscles at the base of your skull to sink just a fraction deeper into the surface beneath you, letting the mattress absorb the full physical reality of your frame. As you lie here in the dark, you might become aware of a specific automated habit, a persistent, checking tension, or a chronic cycle of moral self-policing that has been circulating through your thoughts tonight. Instead of trying to push this protective urge away, or forcing yourself to stop evaluating your past behaviors, see if you can simply give it permission to be observed. You might imagine that this persistent need to scrub away any perceived flaw is like a rough piece of unbleached cloth pressing against a corrugated board, its ribbed surfaces creating a subtle, constant friction inside your awareness. There is no need to judge yourself for holding on to this drive, because it makes complete sense that you would try to secure your safety by keeping your body highly alert before a judging world. Even noticing that your upper shoulders are tensed against the possibility of rejection is enough. A soft, compassionate recognition that requires no struggle and no sudden breakthrough. Perhaps you can look directly at the emotional texture of this habit, naming the pattern quietly inside your own understanding without any blame. You might whisper to yourself softly, "This is the old habit of the frantic scrubbing." Notice where this persistent weariness is expressing itself in your physical body right now, perhaps as a heavy restriction locked down the back of your ears, or a subtle, hot holding across the large muscles that run down to your shoulder blades. If it feels comfortable, imagine mentally allowing the tight fingers of that gripping mind to soften and slide slowly outward, letting the corrugated pine board slide away from your focus without any effort from your hands. You are not abandoning your personal integrity or pretending that your practical life does not matter. You are simply giving your upper body permission to loosen completely into the dark, letting the wash station rest without your active management. With your mind's eye, visualize that specific concern, that stiff line of moral evaluation, being received by the large, empty cedar tub resting beneath the low beams. You do not need to force an immediate transformation. You only need to let the image change at its own speed. Watch as the mental representation naturally begins to alter, the scratchy, tensed texture of the unbleached fabric losing its rigidity as it sinks beneath the calm surface of the cool water. Let the visualization move without any effort from your side, watching the deep wooden vessel absorb the full density of your projections, until the internal atmosphere feels completely uniform, calm, and safe. The brittle debris that filled your focus begins to scatter and separate under the slow cooling of the evening, losing its form entirely as it settles down into the dark stillness of the basin floor. There is complete safety in allowing this inner practice to dissolve into the deep quiet of the room, knowing that you can return to your daily obligations whenever you are ready. For right now, in this unhurried interval, your only requirement is to return to the simple physical surface of your bed. Notice the clean, crisp texture of the linen against your wrists, the cool temperature of the air touching your skin, and the steady, automatic rise and fall of your chest. You do not have to finish the renovation of your soul before the dawn arrives, and you do not need to achieve a state of absolute resolution tonight. The fabric is unrolled, the natural flecks require no further scrubbing, and the water rests clear in the basin, far below the surface of your current awareness. There is no requirement to bleach the raw fiber before the darkness allows you to rest, and you may let your head sink flat upon the supportive stillness for the night, allowing the cool air to take the dust while your presence dissolves into the ground beneath you. As your frame continues to find its natural weight against the bed, perhaps you can perceive how the simple presence of the unbleached hemp bolt represents an entirely different way of moving through your dark hours. It does not try to rewrite the behavior of the midnight wind or grind away its own natural texture. It simply rests its structure against the smooth work table, requiring no final reason to remain completely still under the rafters. You can allow your awareness to rest in that same simple space of immediate reality tonight, choosing not to add another layer of calculations to the words you wish you could have modified. Even noticing that your mind wants to reach for the sharp ridges of the board is enough. A gentle observation that requires no judgment and no force. You can let your thoughts rest on the wet, soothing texture of the limestone that seems to fill the quiet spaces of your mind. A clean and grounded imagery that brings no demands and no parameters. You are not required to guarantee the absolute safety of your future or balance the ledger of your choices before you are permitted to close your eyes. The gray fog is passing outside the windows without any assistance from your vigilance, and the wet linen requires no supervision tonight to justify its position in the wash house. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of self-judgment lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath holding you safe in the dark. Allow the space at the base of your skull to widen naturally, letting the remnants of the day's strain dissolve into the cool shadow of the room. You do not need to construct a permanent meaning out of every social interaction, and you do not need to prove your readiness to a world that has already accepted your presence. The deep well is quiet, the high timber beams are dark, and the air passing through your center is perfectly unencored, spacious and clean. You may let your presence sink deep into this immediate rest, letting the silence take the dust while your soul finds its own original stillness. The freezing midnight fog continued to thicken outside the heavy timber doors, pressing its weight against the small cracks in the stone masonry until the entire washhouse felt completely insulated from the rest of the mountain valley. Chio sat quietly upon a low wooden bench near the main well gate, her upper back leaning lightly against the rough limestone wall, watching the tiny drops of condensation gather along the base of the massive copper cauldrons. Across the room, Sister Jinyo was slowly organizing a stack of dry willow drying pegs, her large hands moving with a heavy, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mimic the slow settling of the mountain itself. The old wash nun did not offer any words of praise to dissolve the young woman's lingering anxieties, and she did not promise that the morning light would bring a sudden gesture of approval from the head administrators of the estate. She simply dipped a clean hemp rag into a bucket of cold well water, using it to wipe away the stray traces of wood ash dust that had settled on the dark oak table during the evening chores. As the middle of the night approached, bringing an absolute heavy silence that seemed to freeze the very air inside the rafters, the peace of the workspace was suddenly broken by a sharp, erratic rattling at the outer latch. A young kitchen helper stumbled through the entrance, his face completely pale with panic and his breath coming in ragged, suffocating gasps that immediately disrupted the quiet atmosphere of the room. In his trembling arms, he held a large, heavily stained altar cloth made of fine, unbleached hemp, its off-white fibers marred by an enormous dark splatter of oily pine soot from the main stoves. The boy was weeping softly as he explained that he had accidentally knocked over a grease pan near the storage crates, and he was terrified that his careless error would lead to his immediate dismissal from the temple grounds before the winter festival began. Chiyo felt an immediate, violent wave of burning heat flare up directly behind her eyeballs, her breathing shortening instantly as her mind began to replay her own long history of public failures and self-reproach. The internal urge to leap up, snatch the soiled fabric from the boy's hands, and begin an aggressive, midnight scouring was almost entirely overwhelming. A fierce, defensive voice inside her head began to scream that if she did not immediately exhaust herself to fix this disaster, she would be found equally responsible, negligent, and entirely unworthy of the shelter she inhabited. She reached her hand automatically toward the corrugated pine ashboard, resting in the alcove, her fingers tightening around the cold wood with a familiar desperate energy, wanting to use the frantic movement of scrubbing to insulate her mind from the terrifying agony of uncertainty. She believed with absolute certainty that a single visible stain on the community's fabric was an existential threat to her own baseline safety. She looked over at Sister Jinyo, who had not even risen from her cedar bench, her massive form remaining perfectly anchored in the shadows near the well gate. The elderly nun did not order Chiyo to begin a heroic, midnight cleansing of the altar cloth, and she did not offer any false reassurances that the grease could be easily erased from the unbleached fibers. She simply allowed her quiet gaze to rest on the dark soot mark, her face completely free from any trace of panic, judgment, or irritation. Chiyo took a long, slow breath of the damp fog, noticing for the first time how her own body was responding to the crisis with the exact same automated rigidity that had locked her neck for many years. She was treating her own racing thoughts as absolute, undeniable truths that had to be obeyed instantly, believing that her identity would be completely ruined if she allowed the stained cloth to exist without an immediate intervention. Instead of rushing toward the heavy cedar tub to begin a frantic, exhausting battle against the grease pan mark, Chiyo chose to perform one small act of quiet discipline. She forced her fingers to loosen their grip on the corrugated ashboard, allowing the wooden tool to slip completely away from her palms, until it rested motionless against the side of the stone bench. She pulled her upper back away from the wall, took another slow, unhurried breath of the alkaline air, and simply sat flat upon her bench, allowing the raw reality of the ruined altar cloth to exist in the room without trying to correct it. For several minutes, the constriction at the base of her skull felt like a heavy band of iron, as her racing intellect tried to convince her that remaining stationary was an act of dangerous neglect. But she refused to obey the internal command to scrub, choosing instead to sit directly with the cold discomfort of the unresolved emergency, letting the water in the basin remain perfectly still. A quiet, fluid warmth began to circulate through the large tendons of her upper shoulders, softening the gray restriction that had kept her body braced since the morning bells. She realized that her lifelong habit of frantic self-correction had never actually protected her from the judgment of the world. It had only turned her own mind into an unyielding, rigid surface that was keeping her heart from ever receiving the authentic comfort of the present hour. She looked at the dark soot mark on the off-white hemp, and she recognized that the true source of her suffering was no longer the boy's mistake or the strictness of the administrators, but her own intense refusal to tolerate an unpolished moment. She stood up slowly, walked over to the shivering kitchen helper, and instead of taking the entire crisis onto her own shoulders through an explosion of tensed energy, she gently wrapped his cold hands in a dry piece of linen scrap. She spoke to the boy in a soft, low voice that carried no trace of urgency, telling him to leave the soiled fabric on the work table and to return to his quarters to seek his rest for the remainder of the night. She did not pretend that the stain had vanished, and she did not promise that the master inspector would be happy with the condition of the altar cloth when the sun rose over the ridge. But she chose to sit with that exact uncertainty, forgiving the boy's clumsiness without needing to erase the physical consequence of the accident before she permitted her own eyes to close. When the apprentice had departed into the midnight fog, she did not pick up the harsh lime water or the ridged board. She simply took the stained hemp fabric and placed it loosely inside a cedar bucket filled with plain, unheated well water, allowing it to soak quietly in the dark without any further manipulation. She did not become a perfectly enlightened person in that single sequence of actions, and she did not pretend that the ancient fear of being found defective had completely disappeared from her awareness. As she walked back toward her resting mat in the rear corner of the washhouse, her upper back still carried a dull, sensitive ache where the old habits of self-policing had lived for so many seasons, and the anticipation of tomorrow's judgment remained a distinct weight behind her ribs. But as she allowed her frame to settle flat upon the support beneath her, she chose to let the unresolved altar cloth remain dark and wet in its wooden bucket, relying on the simple movement of her breath rather than trying to force her history to look flawless before dawn. She allowed her skull base to sink completely into the stillness of the room, her inner world finally spacious enough to hold both the natural beauty of the unbleached fabric and the unpredictable marks of a real human life. The stone wellhouse remained entirely silent. The copper cauldrons cast long shadows across the limestone floorboards, and the water inside the soaking bucket held the dark soot without any violent friction. Jinyo watched from her alcove with a slow, approving nod of her head, her tools laid flat upon her apron as she allowed the tallow wick to burn down to its very base. The future of Chiyo standing in the community remained completely unwritten in the ledger, and the stain on the temple linen remained entirely uncured. Yet the air inside her lungs felt larger and cleaner than it had in many winters. She had stopped treating every anxious thought as an undeniable truth, and in that small shift of perspective, she had finally found the entryway to a rest that required no permission to be claimed. The slow, steady surrender to the damp midnight fog reveals an incredible transformation in how we can treat our internal habits of chronic moral overthinking during these quiet night hours. When we dismantle the hidden machinery of our late-night self-scrupulosity, we continuously find that we are treating our vulnerable human character like an unverified record, trying to force an absolute purity out of the dark so that we never have to face the quiet cold of absolute uncertainty. We live with an unspoken, deep dread of what will happen if our daily behavior shows a sudden drop in value, leaving our sensitivity exposed and our personal dignity completely undefended against an unyielding environment. This persistent fear of being found unready or defective drives us to endlessly rehearse our upcoming interactions, or continuously replay our old errors beneath the blankets, as if our mental tracing could somehow force the flowing universe to match our parameters before the sun rises. We assume that if we can just manage the memory of what was left imperfect with enough intensity, we will eventually earn the right to exist without the sting of guilt. When you look closely at this habit of constant measurement, you can perceive how easily the mind turns its natural fear of failure into a permanent form of identity. You begin to define your very essence not as a living soul who is simply exploring a very complex, unmapped terrain, but as an inadequate candidate whose baseline security is fundamentally fragile, because you cannot guarantee a flawless presentation through the changing season. We try to correct this perceived emotional deficiency by using intense self-judgment and shame as our primary motivators, falsely believing that if we judge our current stillness harshly enough, we will eventually force ourselves to become strong enough to escape randomness. But self-reproach is a cold, brittle frost that cannot bring any true stability to your core. It only keeps your attention locked onto the imaginary shortfalls of your own making. You become so accustomed to the familiar, burning restlessness locked directly behind your eyeballs that you begin to mistake that constant, draining urgency for your actual name. The core insight of ancient wisdom draws a very sharp, very merciful distinction between the raw impact that life naturally delivers and the extra suffering our mind constructs through its own desperate attempts at manipulation. Your journey through this world will always present you with certain unpolished situations, sudden seasonal shifts, moments of physical exhaustion, and intervals where your visible confidence feels entirely buried beneath a heavy drift of doubt. This initial reality is like the damp wind of the washhouse touching an exposed face, a clean, inevitable friction that is simply a part of possessing an authentic, growing human life. But the mind, in its terror of looking useless, immediately transforms that single raw day into an endless emergency. We add an immense secondary burden of stress by demanding that our history should be immediately fixed, or by convincing ourselves that we must completely exhaust our current vitality to force an artificial sheen from the dark. Imagine a large, flat cedar block left out beneath a low wooden shed to age naturally in the raw humidity of the autumn evening, intending to let the rough bark layers adapt to the damp valley moisture at their own organic pace. The timber fibers expand and stabilize because they are allowed to remain still within their quiet workspace, without any human tool to accelerate their texture. But if an anxious worker becomes consumed by a frantic panic that a single grain line might contain an uneven curve, and he begins to take a sharp iron chisel, violently gouging away layer after layer of the wet wood to force it to look perfectly uniform before the night is over, his desperate intervention only splits the core into a heap of frayed, unusable splinters, destroying the very foundation he was trying to protect. He ruins the integrity of the cedar block, not because his hands are intentionally destructive, but because his intense refusal to tolerate a single natural roughness creates a grinding friction that breaks the material's balance. The inherent rough vulnerability of the timber was never a threat to its ultimate utility. Your rigid, hyper-vigilant manipulation of your own human limits is what creates the fracturing stress that disrupts your rest tonight. True peace does not mean that the unwritten chapters of your career, your relationships, or your personal health will suddenly display a flawless blueprint upon your wall, or that the universe will completely change its rules to guarantee you a life without any difficult seasons. Liberation arrives when you finally change your relationship with the unpolished moment itself, allowing the vast container of your present awareness to hold the rough texture without letting that lack of predictability pull your physical body out of its natural alignment. You stop treating every anxious projection as a solid, undeniable reality that must be resolved from your mattress before you are permitted to close your eyes. When you notice a sharp, dense loop of planning arising down the outer sides of your neck, you can perceive it as nothing more than a single loose fiber moving down a very broad river current, a temporary shadow that will naturally spend its density if you simply keep your limbs loose, by letting go of the need to remain a permanent operator over your own destiny. You are not committing an act of neglect against your practical life. You are simply recognizing that true dignity develops its strength deep within the core, entirely out of sight, and no amount of midnight grinding can assist the traveler in finding his center through the dark before he allows the material to cool. This internal transformation is incredibly subtle. It does not require a dramatic breakthrough or a complete rewriting of your practical goals. It is as simple as taking one single, unhurried breath before you follow an old habit of automatic self-correction, noticing the familiar pull behind your ears, and deciding to let the tools of your mind drop away for the remainder of the evening. You are giving your spirit permission to inhabit the actual sanctuary where your spine is resting right now, instead of running back to the unheated workspace of an unchosen year. In a short while, we will explore how this deep weaving barn wisdom can be carried out of the woods and into the specific daily patterns of your modern life. But for right now, let yourself sit with the immense relief that comes when you realize you do not have to finish the architecture of your entire survival plan tonight. The world is turning without your supervision. The unworked fields are holding their positions in the dark, and your value as a living soul requires no validation from a destination that was never meant to show itself in the dark. You are entirely permitted to let the muscles of your jaw become soft and spacious, watching the old habits of calculation lose their grip until there is nothing left to hold on to but the simple, solid reality of this present hour. Let your awareness notice how the habit of self-judgment acts exactly like a layer of dry, hardened dust lining the inside of your mind. We try to use this rigid casing to keep our feelings from shifting, believing that if we can create an absolute boundary against the unknown, our inner world will remain perfectly pristine and untouched by change. But the more we pack our true nature into these artificial compartments, the more we cut ourselves off from the natural warmth of the present moment. We become terrified of our own vulnerability, treating a single moment of stillness or uncertainty as a sign that our entire structure is collapsing into ruin. We forget that a living heart is meant to expand and contract, to feel the full texture of the passing seasons without becoming brittle or cold. When we allow ourselves to look at our anxiety through the simple clarity of the empty carpet frame, we see that true durability comes from being empty, not from being filled with columns of straight lines. The dark timber can execute a beautiful, clean alignment precisely because it does not try to reshape the entire river all at once. It allows its surface to meet the single millimeter directly in front of its natural edge. It holds the weight of the high winter not by fighting the gravity of the foundations, but by restricting its focus to the small circle of available light cast by the lamp. Your spirit is fully capable of this same flexible endurance tonight. You do not need to turn your mind into a permanent factory to survive the transitions of your life. You can allow your awareness to become like that unpainted cedar frame, letting the warmth of the passing hours move through your center without leaving a single line of tension behind. Let the tight grip down the outer sides of your neck dissolve completely into the supportive surface beneath you, feeling how the mattress receives the full weight of your frame without asking for a single proof of your perfection. You do not have to settle the ultimate value of your words before your eyes close, and you do not need to find an accurate answer for every upcoming freeze before the sun rises. The river lane is completely dark, the wild reeds are resting in the damp mist, and the great canopy of the night is turning its uncounted stars without a single effort from your mind. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of calculation lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath holding you safe in the dark. This quiet wellhouse perspective is never meant to remain locked within a low stone shed near the freezing mountain ridges. It belongs directly in the middle of your modern digital afternoons. We carry our heavy, interlocking mental grids into bright offices, down crowded streets, and right into the tight suspense that follows a sudden phone notification. Think of those specific moments during your week when your hand reaches out automatically to tap a dark glass surface, looking over and over for some small sign of confirmation or reassurance from an external source. In that small, high-stress interval, your inner life is acting exactly like an anxious temple cleaner in a dark outbuilding, frantically driving a sharp instrument through the fibers to ensure your presence does not show a single day of vacancy to the world. You are treating an unanswered message or a delayed validation like a critical breakdown in your visible presentation, spending your limited current vitality to force an immediate response from a landscape that cannot be micromanaged. Consider how often you walk through your daily obligations with a practiced expression of confidence pinned to your features, while your deeper chest is carrying an entire weight of cold trembling through the urban plazas. You smile gently while feeling completely heavy inside, pretending to have everything perfectly calculated because you worry that if anyone glimpses the natural, off-white variations on your fingers, they will realize you are no longer executing the traditional expected speed your environment demanded of you. We watch the beautifully filtered, optimized lives of our peers on digital networks, comparing our hidden, unheated hearths with their visible fires, fearing that our own timeline is lagging behind a standard we never actually chose to carry. You feel an intense, crushing guilt whenever you try to sit loosely in a chair or lie down early on your mattress, believing that your physical rest is a luxury you are only allowed to purchase after every single upcoming flaw has been fully countered. But this old Washnun's wisdom offers an incredibly practical way to step away from the corrugated ashboard without needing to overturn your entire external environment. You can begin to express a quiet, spacious discipline right in the center of your kitchen or your desk, long before the sun goes down. When an old pattern of replaying a past mistake flashes across your awareness during a tensed conversation, or when a sudden fear of the future tightens your stomach, you can choose to introduce a brief, unhurried pause before your voice leaps out to defend itself. This pause is a deliberate letting go of the thin pine ridges, a moment where you look at the rigidity in your back and realize that this automated thought is just a single loose vapor moving across a very broad sky. It does not mean your whole life is collapsing into ruin. You are choosing not to give your living hands to an old mechanical routine, allowing the raw fibers of your mind to separate naturally without your active management. You can hold a profound, beautiful devotion for the people who share your life without turning that care into a tight, strangling grip that tries to force their movements into a shape that feels safe to your anxiety. When we try to force a partner, a child, or a friend to match our internal map, we are simply trying to squeeze their living tissue through our own unfeeling mold, an exhausting manipulation that leaves both people feeling raw and empty inside. True connection acts more like that vast, unmapped mountain forest, remaining broad and steady, allowing the other person to exist without needing to satisfy your internal calculations. You do not need to turn their actions into a proof of your worth to make your own existence valid, because your capacity for awareness is already deep enough to contain whatever winter wind moves through the room. Allow your mind to absorb the liberating truth that you do not need to earn your right to lie perfectly still on this bed, and your value as a living being is not dependent on how many offerings you manage to complete today. You can let your bones become heavy right now, simply because the dark has arrived, and the foundations beneath your room are entirely ready to sustain your weight without asking for a single proof of your validation. You can let the unwritten tomorrow go completely dark tonight, understanding that the only current that contains any genuine warmth, any real life, or any real breath is the one passing through your lungs in this precise second. The future you are endlessly rehearsing is just a cold machine your anxiety is spinning out of dry dust, a pattern that carries no actual substance unless you choose to pull it over your chest before the day has even dawned. When you notice your attention creeping forward to predict an old disappointment or mourn a misstep you did not prevent, You can gently hold the movement without a single trace of anger or self-judgment. You might smile at how deeply your conditioning wants to protect you by dragging you back to the unheated factory. And you can offer that anxious habit a moment of soft validation. You can say to your own heart, the short tool has already been left in the dark corner alcove. The workspace is empty, and there is absolutely no debt left to pay in the middle of the night. Let the simple texture of the present environment settle into your awareness, noticing how the quietness of the hour fits perfectly around your frame. You do not need to resolve the dilemmas of your career or balance the ledger of your relationships before your eyes close. The dark air moving through the room requires no production reports from you, and it carries no memory of the errors you believe you made during the daylight hours. You are allowed to be an uncarved, quiet piece of stone tonight, a presence that is completely at ease with its own mystery. The short willow pegs have found their rest, the alpine outposts are silent, and the space right beneath your ears is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. We often imagine that our value must be continually proven to the world through a sequence of loud achievements, like an animal driven through a narrow gate under the watch of a stern overseer. But notice how completely the dark sky rejects that narrow arithmetic. It does not ask the trees to give an account of their seasonal growth before it allows them to drop their leaves into the moss. And it does not monitor the depth of the roots to see if they have earned their winter safety. The environment receives the life simply because it is there, holding the weight of the forest with an ancient, silent patience that never shifts its baseline. You can match that soft, unhurried surrender tonight by choosing to let your own uncounted hours remain empty of any further calculations or plans. Let your upper shoulders expand into the vast, quiet space of the mattress, feeling the organic warmth of your own center rising up to replace the cold density of the metal wedges you dropped. You are discovering that your life does not need to be a continuous assembly line against an unformed future. It can be a simple, light journey that flows around the obstacles just like the open water. Every long breath you take is a clean release of the extra suffering you have been layering on top of your history. A gentle return to the unadorned simplicity of your own being. You are safe here, you are unguided, and you are entirely free to let the watchman's fire burn down to cold ash while you sink into the deep, restorative dark. The steady, heavy settling of the midnight fog against the exterior stone blocks has grown completely quiet now, and the thick, wet mist that drifted from the outbuilding eaves has dissolved into the deep, spacious dark of the winter sky. Let the language itself begin to loosen its grain, softening its pace until every single syllable lands like a soft drop of well water settling into a calm, unmoving basin. Your physical form is becoming immense and heavy, sinking down through the supportive layers of the bed as the fresh, unhurried presence of the silent washhouse settles across the front of your face. The long daily watch over your internal metrics has ended for the night, and the corrugated pine board has been left completely abandoned inside the dark corner alcove, far below the surface of your current awareness. The mental scrubbing is still, and your fingers have forgotten the permanent curl around the tensed wooden ridges. Listen to the quiet automatic expansion of your abdomen, a soft wave of movement that requires no diagrams, no strict parameters, and no testing from your intellect. With each long exhalation, the spaces behind your eyeballs soften completely, letting go of the residual burning heat that has lived behind your skull base since your earliest encounter with an unchosen standard. You are drifting back into the broad, unmapped clearing of your true nature, a clear, open landscape that is entirely capable of holding its own stillness without your active guidance. The rigid lines of your silent self-reproaches have dissolved into the crisp night air, leaving nothing but the simple, unhurried density of your body resting against the mattress. There is no longer any temporary performance to settle before the light returns, and no upcoming path is asking to be verified in the quiet of this hour. The unbleached hemp fabrics are resting quietly in their dark cedar buckets, undisturbed, unmarked, and completely whole in their simple surrender to the soaking water. Let your upper back become twice as heavy as before, closing out the memory of the old evaluations, closing out the search for a perfect presentation that was never meant to define your capacity for peace. You are granted full permission to leave your unwritten chapters unmanaged tonight, to let the defensive machinery go entirely slack, without trying to settle a single account with your history. The wild mountain fields are sleeping perfectly well without your surveillance. The dark is cradling your shoulder blades without a single condition, and you are allowed to slip quietly beneath the weight of your self-protection. Allow your spirit to sink into the vast, undisturbed vacancy of a natural fabric that has no need for a bleaching agent to justify its space. As your breath becomes even slower and quieter, a profound sense of coming home begins to spread through every tissue of your frame, filling the spaces where the old urgency used to dwell. You are returning to the simple, raw reality of being alive, a presence that requires no flawless offering to justify its place in the world. The deep stone well is silent, the workshop benches are still, and the sharp scent of the alkaline water has faded into the vast, dark canopy of the night. Sleep is your only destination now, a deep and unhindered rest that receives you exactly as you are, without a single line left to calculate. Allow yourself to slide all the way through the final layers of the evening, trusting the dark to hold your spirit while you rest whole, undisturbed, and beautifully complete until the morning comes, when the raw flax cloth is left to float loosely in the unheated basin. What remains to demand that the organic texture be scrubbed into a smooth white illusion?